I'd like to welcome you here this evening for our lecture. I'm Greg Forbes from the Department of Biological Sciences here at GRCC, and we're co-hosting the presentation tonight with Michigan Humanists. We've been working with Michigan Humanists in different iterations as Free Thought Association, as Center for Inquiry for probably the last 25 years, and we look forward to every presentation that we're able to share with them. We welcome you to our campus this evening. Looking forward to seeing the presenter tonight, Glenn Branch, and I've known about him for many, many years in working with the National Center for Science Ed, but never actually had a chance to meet with him. I'm really excited to see what he has to say tonight. And other than that, I'm going to give you Tim, who's going to do the introduction. I just wanted to introduce you and thank you for attending tonight.
Thanks a lot, Greg. My name is Tim Postma. I'm the treasurer for the Michigan Humanists, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about us before we get started with tonight's lecture. If you are not familiar with us, we have two missions, and the one is to advance a secular community. And by secular, we mean you can kind of call yourself anything you want, atheist, agnostic, humanist, skeptic, or free thinker. I guess you just aren't calling yourself religious, or not too religious anyway. And by community, we share experiences, offer support, engage in community service, and our goal with all of that is to kind of end the bad vibes attached to being a non-believer. The second part of our mission is to promote humanist values, and that includes reason, science, and church and state separation. And more specifically, we oppose the influence of religion and pseudoscience, and I'm sure we're going to hear about what's not pseudoscience later on. And we oppose those in public policy, and we also defend the rights of non-religious people. We have a lot of events, and hopefully you've been to one or more of them. There's Cafe Inquiry, Skeptics in the Pub, Living Without Religion, and the Sci-Fi Book Club. All of those meet monthly. We have these kinds of lectures quarterly or so. Most of the time they're right here. And annually, if this past December, we had the annual solstice dinner, and if you haven't been to that, that's a lot of fun. And of course, we also do a fair amount of volunteering. The next one that's coming up, it's not in the calendar yet, so keep your eyes open for it, is the Long Lake Work Day. That's going to be probably in April or May, and that precedes the annual Secular Summer Retreat, which will be in July, most likely. That's when it usually is. Not on the calendars yet on the website, but keep them in mind, write them down if you're interested in something like that. We have a table outside the lecture hall where you can sign up for the newsletter. That tells you everything is going on. There's a donations jar that's also outside, and you can pick up a calendar of event or stickers. Also, all of this stuff is also available on the website if you just want to go online and figure it all out. After tonight's lecture, there's going to be a Q&A for a little while, and then if you want to hang out with Glenn a little bit more, or a few of us, you can pop over to Graydon's Crossing. That address is 1223 Plainfield. And there will also be a video of tonight's lecture posted on the website shortly afterwards. Okay, with all that in mind, let me introduce you to tonight's speaker, Mr. Glenn Branch. Glenn is the Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education. That's a non-for-profit organization that defends the integrity of American science education against ideological interference. He is the author of numerous articles on evolution education, climate education, and obstacles to them in such publications as Scientific American, American Educator, the American Biology Teacher, and the Annual Review of Genomics and Human Genetics. Glenn is also the co-editor with Eugenie C. Scott of Not in Our Classrooms, Why Intelligent Design is Wrong for Our Schools. That was published in 2006. He received the Evolution Education Award in 2020 from the National Association of Biology Teachers. Glenn has a BA in philosophy from Brandeis University and an MA in philosophy from UCLA. So again, thank you to GRCC Biology Department for co-sponsoring this event with us. And please join me in welcoming Mr. Glenn Branch for Twists and Turns in Teaching Evolution over the years.
Thanks for that introduction, Tom. They say deputy director, but it really translates more into utility infielder. Anyhow, unless I've messed up my very first slide, I'm going to be talking to you tonight about twists and turns in teaching evolution over the years, with a special emphasis, as far as I can manage it, on events in Michigan. So imagine that you had the use of a time machine, and of course we're interested in the teaching of evolution. If you traveled a century back in time to March 1925, what could you expect to encounter besides a nasty note from the physics department? Well, you wouldn't find any controversies, at least as far as K through 12 education goes, but you'd find that the conditions were ripe. In 1925, after all, the Great War was still a live memory. And thanks in part to a Stanford biologist, Vernon Kellogg, who reported from the front that a German colleague told him that the war was a manifestation of the Darwinian struggle for existence. Evolution was popularly associated in the American mind with the horrors of the ensuing war. Also in 1925, a struggle for the control of American Protestant denominations was continuing. Modernists seemed to be prevailing, so fundamentalists organized under that name and published a series of pamphlets, the Fundamentals, between 1910 and 1915 to articulate their position and to stake out their claims. Not all of these pamphlets were anti-evolution, but fundamentalism was soon to harden into anti-evolutionism. And in 1925, American public education was continuing to broaden in the wake of the Great War. Many students, particularly in rural areas, were being exposed for the first time to more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic, and being exposed to books like George Hunter's Civic Biology, of which this is a page, which included the concept of evolution. And many parents didn't welcome this broadening of their children's cultural horizons. The result, representing the first of three waves of anti-evolutionism we'll be looking at tonight, was a crusade to ban the teaching of evolution in America's public schools. The first proposed bill to do so was in Kentucky in 1922. It failed to win passage in the state's legislature, thanks in large part to the lobbying of science professors at the University of Kentucky. In 1925, a similar bill, called the Butler Act, after its sponsor John Washington Butler, passed the Tennessee legislature and was signed into law by Governor Austin Peay on March 21st. So that's 100 years ago minus 9 days. The Butler Act made it illegal to teach in a state-supported school, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man, as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. The American Civil Liberties Union, then just a baby organization, wanted to organize a legal challenge to the Butler Act and sought a teacher willing to be the defendant in a test case. This is from the Chattanooga Daily Times. The publicity came to the attention of a group of businessmen in Dayton, Tennessee, up the road a piece from Chattanooga, who saw an opportunity to attract attention, and they thought money, to their town. And they recruited John Thomas Scopes, a fresh college graduate hoping to pursue graduate studies. He was working as a school teacher to save up money. He taught general science and coached a little football. He was actually a pretty good football coach. He didn't approve of the Butler Act. He had witnessed his teachers at the University of Kentucky lobby against it. So he agreed to be a defendant in a test case, what would be Tennessee versus Scopes. Scopes was at, as he entitled his memoir, the center of the storm. Representing the trial was the most famous defense lawyer of his day, Clarence Darrow, on the far left there. Although Darrow wasn't the first or the only attorney representing Scopes, there were also prominently the famously erratic and slovenly John Randolph Neal, the great orator Dudley Field Malone, who later worked as a character actor in Hollywood. He played Churchill in one movie. And Arthur Garfield Hayes of the ACLU, of whom the joke was told he was named after 3 Republican presidents. Likewise, although he wasn't the only member of the prosecution team, William Jennings Bryan got the headlines. A 3-time presidential candidate and Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, Bryan became involved in the anti-evolution crusade on his retirement around 1922 and spent a lot of time lobbying to get anti-evolution legislation passed in states around the country, including Tennessee. Now, Bryan made headlines by serving on the prosecution team, but he made even more headlines when he agreed to Darrow's request, a highly unusual request, to testify at the Scopes trial as an expert witness on the Bible. The resulting examination was devastating, at least as far as the big city newspapers were concerned. Bryan came across as both ignorant and complacent about his ignorance. But what mattered, of course, was the reaction of the jury. What would their verdict be? Well, the verdict decided that Scopes had indeed violated the Butler Act. The judge imposed a fine of $100, and that was that. Well, in fact, that wasn't that. The defense team, halfway or 3/4 of the way, expected to lose at trial and had been conducting its case with an eye to winning on appeal. The verdict was appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, this madcap bunch, and they overturned Scopes' conviction on a technicality. There was no ruling against the law itself. The court was clearly trying to avoid further controversy for the state, writing, "We see nothing to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case." The Butler Act remained on the books. Bryan died soon after the trial, and only 2 other states, Arkansas and Mississippi, enacted bans on teaching evolution. Although there weren't any legislative bans on the teaching of evolution proposed in Michigan in the 1920s, there was still controversy. The Flint Daily Herald editorialized in 1925, quote, "Any man of the 20th century who will stand for evolution is not, despite his appearance from a physical standpoint, a member of the race of humankind." On the other hand, Alfred Wesley Wishart wrote a 1923 book defending the compatibility of evolution and Christianity against Bryan when he was serving as the minister of Fountain Street Baptist Church right here in Grand Rapids. He doesn't look like an inhuman monster, but of course you can't be too careful about these things. Yet, even in states without bans on the teaching of evolution, the topic went into educational abeyance. Fearing controversy, textbook publishers downplayed the subject, and a 1940 national survey showed that barely more than half of high school biology teachers nationally were teaching evolution at all. A hit Broadway play of 1955 and a subsequent Hollywood blockbuster in 1960 brought the Butler Act back into the public eye. Lawrence and Lee's Inherit the Wind was not intended as a documentary. "We use the teaching of evolution as a parable," Lawrence told a newspaper in 1996. "A metaphor for any kind of mind control. It's not about science versus religion, it's about the right to think." But that didn't stop anyone from inferring that the movie was about the fabulous monkey trial that rocked America, to quote the poster. Scopes, who had to leave graduate school at the University of Chicago, where he was studying geology owing to the Depression, and spent his career working as a petroleum geologist, was recruited to publicize the movie and attended its premiere in Dayton, Tennessee, the first time he had visited the town since 1931. Teachers still had to sign a pledge that they wouldn't teach evolution, he ruefully observed. And evolution was beginning to re-enter the public schools in the 1960s thanks to a polished metal sphere, 21 inches in diameter. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. Fearing a loss in the space race, the US federal government poured funds into improving science, which included improving science education, which included improving biology education, which included evolution. In Arkansas, one of the 3 states with Scopes-era bans on the teaching of evolution, a Little Rock teacher named Susan Epperson was told by her school to teach from a new textbook that had been revised to include evolution, which would force her to violate the law. She sued the state, And the case wound its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1968 ruled that the ban violated the First Amendment. Scopes was still around, I'm pleased to say, and welcomed the decision striking down the ban on evolution, telling the Associated Press that as far as he was concerned, the decision came 43 years too late. The following year, he and Epperson had lunch together in Shreveport, where he was retired. Here they are. Scopes died in 1970. With evolution back in the textbooks and back in the classrooms, and with legal barriers to its teaching falling to legal challenge or being repealed by legislatures, the stage was set for our second wave of anti-evolution activity. It no longer being possible to ban the teaching of evolution, creationists instead attempted to balance the teaching of evolution. Well, balance it with what? In the first instance, with the Bible. This fellow is Russell Artist. Born in 1911, died in 2000, so that's a portrait of Artist as a young man. Sorry. Artist was a biology professor at a religious college, Daniel Lipscomb in Nashville, a member of the Creation Research Society, a pseudo-scholarly group of creationists, and a contributor to the creationist textbook, seen to the right there, published in 1970. The state Tennessee Textbook Commission would not approve that textbook for use in Tennessee's public schools. So thanks to Artist's urging, in 1973, a law was passed by the Tennessee legislature requiring that textbooks that discuss evolution represented as a theory, not fact, and give an equal amount of attention to other theories, including but not limited to the Genesis account of the Bible. This law was challenged promptly in both state and federal courts. The federal case was Daniel versus Waters. Joe Daniel, seen here, was a zoology professor at the University of Tennessee, and Waters was the chair of the Textbook Commission. So the court ruled that the law violated the constitutional guarantee of separation of church and state, in part because it gave a preferential position to the Bible, and in part because it explicitly provided, you'll love this, that occult or satanic theories were not covered by the law, further indicating its religious motivations in effect. There's a well-known engraving by Gustave Doré. Some say that it shows the fall of Satan from heaven, as imagined in Paradise Lost, but I think it shows him being banished from Tennessee, probably to Kentucky. So creationists couldn't balance evolution with biblical creationism. In the second instance, then, they tried to balance it with something called creation science. In content, creation science is probably what you think of when you think of creationism, because it is currently the dominant form of creationism in the United States. Creation science claims that the Earth, and indeed the universe, are about 6,000 years old, thousands, not billions, certainly, that living things are specially created by God to reproduce after their own kind, meaning evolution between or across kinds is impossible, and that Noah's flood was a historic worldwide event responsible for a narrow genetic bottleneck among terrestrial vertebrates, most of the fossil record, and major geological features like the Grand Canyon. This secularization of biblical creationism was widely influential. In the late 70s and early 80s, literally dozens of states saw legislation that would have required teaching creation science when evolution was taught. And there were maybe half a dozen attempts in Michigan in the 1970s. None was successful. But two laws, one in Arkansas and one in Louisiana, like this were enacted in 1981. The Arkansas law was quickly ruled unconstitutional in a landmark trial, McLean versus Arkansas, in 1982. Now, Arkansas's law was particularly vulnerable because it was very specific. I'm not going to read this whole slide out, but as you can see, it talked about creation ex nihilo, from nothing, evolution only within kinds, a worldwide flood, a young earth. But Louisiana's law defined creation science very meagerly, as consisting of the scientific evidences for creation and inferences from those scientific evidences without ever going so far as to say what those were. There's a reason for that. Louisiana's law and Arkansas's law had a common ancestor, you should excuse the expression, in a model equal time bill, which was adopted from a model school board policy prepared by the Institute for Creation Research. The day on which Louisiana stripped all those references from its bill was the day after the Arkansas bill was challenged in federal court. They could take a hint. So it seems clear that the proponents of creation science were worried that it wouldn't survive constitutional scrutiny as something to be taught in the public schools. The Institute for Creation Research declined to participate in the Arkansas trial at all, but it hoped and worked for success in the Louisiana trial, even managing to get its legal counsel appointed as a special state attorney general for the case. Yet the comparative reticence of Louisiana's Equal Time for Creation Science Act didn't help it. When the challenge to it finally reached the Supreme Court, the ruling in Edwards versus Aguillard, 1987, was, quote, "The act impermissibly endorses religion by advancing the religious belief that a supernatural being created humankind." That's the lead plaintiff, Donald Aguillard, there, standing next to a brightly orange-clad Susan Epperson. Nevertheless, the idea still beckoned of further disinfecting creationism of its overtly religious content. In the third instance of balancing the teaching of evolution with something else, something called intelligent design was concocted by a couple of ministries in Texas, adopted by a conservative think tank in Seattle called the Discovery Institute, and promoted by people like Michael Behe, a biochemist at Lehigh University, and books like Of Pandas and People. You can't fault Michael Behe's dress sense, is what I always say. You can understand intelligent design's project best by understanding it as finding something that can be built as a scientific alternative to evolution while surviving constitutional scrutiny. So its proponents deny that its view entails any particular conception of the designer. It could be God, they concede, but it could be aliens from outer space or time-traveling biochemists from the far future. I'm not making this up. Similarly, the intelligent design movement seeks to maintain a big tent under which anti-evolutionists of all stripes are welcome to shelter, including, in principle, young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, ultra-Orthodox Jewish creationists, Islamic creationists, Hare Krishna creationists who take their cues from Hindu scripture, Native American creationists, New Age creationists. Well, almost. The intelligent design movement takes no official position on the issues that divide anti-evolutionists. Maybe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, maybe it's 6,000 years old, maybe as with the Hare Krishna creationists, it's trillions of years old. Likewise for common descent, likewise for Noah's flood, whatever you like, as long as you reject evolution, seems to be the motto. Almost. About the only anti-evolution group unwelcome to shelter under intelligent design's big tent is a clone-crazed, alien-worshipping, free-love UFO cult run by a former race car driver, the Raelians. Their public announcement of support for teaching intelligent design in the public schools was met with a stony silence. But their exclusion from the big tent was presumably only tactical. Okay, again, intelligent design, highly non-committal. The central message is that somewhere, at some point in time, some intelligent agent did something, somehow, for some reason, that affected the history of life, somehow. But given that most students in American public schools are going to have preconceived notions about where, when, who, how, what, and why, the intention and the effect of teaching intelligent design as scientifically credible are pretty clear. And make no mistake, despite the protestations and pretensions of its promoters to be engaged in rigorous scientific inquiry, the first book to use intelligent design in the specific sense is Of Pandas and People, which was produced and marketed as a supplementary high school biology textbook. In its attempts to infiltrate public schools, however, intelligent design received a serious setback in 2005. In Dover, Pennsylvania, circled here in yellow, in 2004, the school board was arguing about what biology textbooks to adopt, with one board member complaining that the standard textbooks were laced with Darwinism and seeking to have Of Pandas and People adopted. Eventually, the board adopted a policy on teaching intelligent design, which was implemented as a 4-paragraph statement that had to be read aloud to students. The teachers refused to read it, so administrators had to slink in and do it instead. Among other things, this disclaimer recommended Of Pandas and People to the students' attention. There were enough copies to go around, as yet anonymous citizens had donated dozens of copies to the school. So, 11 local parents filed suit. The case was dubbed Kitzmiller versus Dover. I can tell you this, the plaintiff's legal team decided to have Tammy Kitzmiller as the lead plaintiff for 2 reasons. One reason is she had a child in the 9th grade biology class, so could claim that her child was in imminent danger, for legal purposes, of being harmed by the policy. The other is they liked her last name. Good, solid, euphonious Pennsylvania Dutch surname, Kitzmiller. They like that. So, representing the board was a religious right organization from Michigan, I'm afraid, the Thomas More Law Center. That's Domino's Pizza money. Initially, the Discovery Institute, the de facto institutional headquarters of intelligent design, was going to participate, but they squabbled with the Thomas More folks. Various luminaries of the intelligent design movement were slated to testify, but 2 out of 3 of the most important ones bailed as a result of the squabble. Representing the 11 parents were the ACLU of Pennsylvania, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and a private law firm, Pepper Hamilton. The National Center for Science Education, where I work, so is my colleague who came out to support me. Hi, Wendy. NCSC devoted countless hours to the case. My former colleague Nick Motsky basically worked 60 hours a week for over a year on it. And 3 members of our board of directors were expert witnesses. Just to note another Michigan connection, one of those expert witnesses was Robert T. Pennock, that is now a professor of philosophy at Michigan State, who had written one of the first and best scholarly books on the intelligent design movement, Tower of Babel, from 2002. Anyhow, after a trial occupying a biblical 40 days, with extensive expert testimony, the verdict came in. The judge, a Republican, a churchgoer, and a George W. Bush appointee, found that the school district's policy violated the Establishment Clause because intelligent design, like creation science before it, represents a religious belief. His decision came out on December 20th, 2005, so we like to say it was a Merry Kitzmas for the plaintiffs. Yeah. Now, the proponents of intelligent design are soldiering on even unto this day. But Kitzmiller really put a fairly decisive stop to the second wave of anti-evolution activity. Despite the trend we've seen of trying to get ever more secular-seeming versions of creationism, it seems that intelligent design has got to be the end of the line. You just can't get more vague and non-committal than that. Special slide for you guys. It's just a speculation, but I think that the Kitzmiller had a substantial effect on Michigan politics. Think back to 2006, when Dick DeVos, a wealthy businessman, Amway money, from Grand Rapids, was the Republican candidate for governor running against incumbent Democrat Jennifer Granholm. Now, DeVos was running on economic issues, and prospective voters, feeling the bite of Michigan's then weak economy, seemed to be kind of receptive to that. But at a campaign stop on September 8th, 2006, a guy named Eric Fallman, a member of NCSE's, by the way, asked DeVos about teaching evolution. And DeVos replied that he supported teaching intelligent design alongside evolution. He didn't mention Of Pandas and People, especially. This incident, I think, led to the media's paying a lot more attention to DeVos's views on science education and on social rather than economic issues generally. And DeVos had what the electorate viewed as a lot of extreme social views. September 7th, the day before he endorsed Teaching Intelligent Design, was the last day on which he pulled ahead of Granholm, as seen here. And he ended up with only 42% of the vote, as opposed to Granholm's 56%. So, with that second strategy no longer being a winner for the creationists, Kitzmiller ushered in a third wave of anti-evolutionism in the US. Now, it no longer being possible to ban the teaching of evolution or to balance the teaching of evolution, creationists have to try to establish formal policies blunting the teaching of evolution. It has to begin with B, obviously. Catchphrases associated with this third wave include theory, not fact, teach the controversy, academic freedom, evidence for and evidence against, strengths and weaknesses, critical analysis, and so endlessly on. All of these appeal to secular considerations and Enlightenment values, but they're used in the service of a darker agenda, and of course applied selectively to evolution. These are not new catchphrases. It's not entirely a new strategy. What's new is using such phrases in the absence of any supposed alternative to evolution. Creationists have always had these phrases in their arsenal of arguments. You'll see them as far back as the Scopes era. What's new is that they have nothing that they feel they can count, nothing else that they feel they can count on. Within this wave of anti-evolution activity, in which again the idea is to blunt the teaching of evolution, there have been two approaches. The first is to require the blunting. Florida's Senate Bill 1854 from 2011 would have required schools to provide a thorough presentation and critical analysis of the scientific theory of evolution. Well, gosh, that sounds good. Until you realize that critical analysis for this legislature is code for criticism. There's really no question about this because he had previously described the bill as saying, well, if you're going to teach evolution, then you have to teach the other side. I wonder what that could be. So you can have critical thinking. Now, a problem with bills requiring the teaching of evolution, blunting the teaching of evolution, not the crucial problem, is that it inspires a lot of questions, like what that is that you're going to teach, where we're going to find it, who's going to pay for it. And they also raise the hackles of teachers, who understandably don't want to be micromanaged by the legislature. Consequently, a string of bills adopting the second of these blunting approaches has been more popular. These do not require, but instead permit something to be taught, often under the rubric of academic freedom. There have been about 100 of these bills introduced since 2002, with 3 unfortunately being enacted in Mississippi, Louisiana, and most recently, Tennessee. Both amusing and ironic is the fact that my former NCSC colleague Nick Motzke managed to get a publication in the prestigious journal Nature by applying phylogenetic methods, which is to say evolutionary methods, to the text of these bills to reveal their genealogical relations. I like to call this Motzke's Kitsmas tree. You probably can't see them because, look at it. But there are 2 bills from Michigan on this chart. The identical House Bill 6027 and Senate Bill 1361 from 2008 sought to disguise their target a little by including biological evolution along with the chemical origins of life, human impact of climate change, and human cloning as supposedly controversial issues. This is a fairly common tactic for this kind of bill, although no one has explained to my satisfaction why they're discussing human cloning. This is not a staple of American science education. Why would it be? Anyhow, both of these Michigan bills died in committee without too much fuss, but as I noted, a few have been enacted elsewhere. Let's look at a key provision of the most recent of these from Tennessee. What this says is that when it comes to the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of theories covered in the state science standards, teachers are basically free to do whatever they want to help students understand, analyze, critique, and review in an objective manner those strengths and weaknesses, free from any oversight. Since none of these terms are defined and no way to adjudicate among competing definitions of them is provided, the laws in effect encouraged science teachers with idiosyncratic opinions, like this one in the cartoon, to teach anything they please, so long as they're able to claim with a straight face that they're helping students appreciate scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses, et cetera, et cetera. Earlier versions of the bill in Tennessee specifically cited biological evolution, and it seems quite clear that legislative support for the bill was based on the perception that it would empower and embolden teachers to present creationism in one form or another in their science classrooms. A former speaker of the Tennessee House of Representatives nicknamed it the monkey bill, and you should know. But there's more. The law is profoundly undemocratic. As matters stand in the United States, public education is ultimately under democratic control. The people vote for representatives at the local, state, and federal level, who then set policy that's enacted by administrators, who all wear hats and carry briefcases, through managing classroom teachers. This is so basic you can represent it all in clip art. I apologize for the sexism of the clip art. But the academic freedom anti-evolution bills, by prohibiting administrators from reining in rogue teachers, make those teachers unaccountable to the public. According to a nationally representative survey conducted in 2007, about 1 in 8 high school biology teachers then was presenting creationism as scientifically credible in their classrooms. How much worse would it be if bills like this were widely adopted? So that brings you up to date, more or less, on the 100 years of anti-evolution activity in the United States since the Scopes trial, but it doesn't account for all the important anti-evolution activity. Since the 1990s, there have been battles over the place of evolution in state science standards, to which we now turn. State science standards are documents that specify what knowledge and skills students are expected to acquire in the course of their science education. So they have a pervasive and important role in K through 12 science education. Pretty much as soon as they started to be introduced across the country in the 1990s as part of a push for outcome-based education, it was clear to everybody that if evolution was going to be in the state science standards, it was more likely to make it into the classroom. Creationists realized this as fast as anybody. As early as 1995, the Alabama State Board of Education inserted a provision in the state science standards that required evolution not to be presented dogmatically, and then used that to require a disclaimer to be pasted in all the biology textbooks used in Alabama's public schools. Visible attempts to undermine the treatment of evolution state standards has been occurred over the country over the last 25 years in at least 20 states, shown in red here, including Michigan. A 2001 bill in Michigan would have revised the state science standards to describe evolution and natural selection as unproven theories, and to mention, quote, the theory that life is the result of the purposeful, intelligent design of a creator. Among the co-sponsors was the chair of the House Education Committee. Thankfully, this failed to pass. In 2005, House Bill 5251 would have revised the Michigan standards to require students, quote, use the scientific method to critically evaluate, there's one of those phrases again, scientific theories, including but not limited to the theories of global warming and evolution, and use relevant scientific data to assess the validity of those theories and to formulate arguments for or against those theories. This didn't go anywhere either. Even where there haven't been such battles, there's no reason for complacency. In 2009, 2 of my colleagues evaluated the treatment of evolution in state science standards all over the country. The states marked with the darker colors are the worst, but a familiar 2-part state got a decent B. There have been some changes in the last 16 years, most of them, I'm pleased to say, for the better. The biggest development in state science standards in the last 15 years was the release of the Next Generation Science Standards in 2013. The NGSS are a model set of standards developed by a consortium of nonprofit organizations in 26 states, including Michigan. the so-called lead state partners promised to give serious consideration to adopting the final product. Now, the NGSS highlight biological evolution, unity and diversity, as a disciplinary core idea of the life sciences. That's good. By now, 20 states plus the District of Columbia have adopted the NGSS, and a further 25 states have adopted standards based on the same evolution-friendly framework on which the NGSS were built. Michigan adopted the NGSS in 2013, despite legislation that would have prevented it from doing so. That seems to have been because the sponsor was worried about climate change more than evolution, however. There were a few minor modifications to add some Michigano-centric examples, that kind of thing in various contexts, but the content about evolution in Michigan state standards is pretty much just the same as in the NGSS. As it happens, there's evidence from 2 national surveys of high school science teachers conducted in 2007 and 12 years later in 2019 that improving the treatment of evolution in state science standards improves classroom results. I'll describe one piece of that evidence. So shown here is a 4-fold typology of teachers according to whether they report endorsing evolution as scientifically settled and whether they reported endorsing creationism as scientifically credible. We want teachers to be at the northeast quadrant there, emphasizing the broad scientific consensus on evolution while not emphasizing creationism as a valid scientific alternative, because it isn't. When we compare the 2007 and 2019 surveys, there's definite progress. From 51% of teachers in that good old northeast quadrant to 67% in just 12 years, and that, of course, is matched by drops in the other kinds of teachers. What's the explanation for this massive and rapid improvement in evolution education? Part of it seems to involve improvements in state science standards. NGSS states were not particularly hospitable to the teaching of evolution before they adopted the NGSS. Only half of their teachers were in that northeast quadrant in 2007. In 2019, 69% were. Teachers in NGSS states reported having taken more pre-service and more in-service coursework in evolution than their colleagues elsewhere. So it seems that the increased expectations of the better standards impelled both novice and veteran teachers to improve their content knowledge of evolution. These are pre-service teachers at Cornell. Prediction is uncertain, especially about the future, but But let me offer a 3-part forecast. First, we're not going to see any lasting anti-evolution policy enacted, whether in the form of legislation or attacks on standards. That's not to say that there won't be attacks such as these. Earlier this year, there was a bill introduced in North Dakota that would have added intelligent design to the state science standards there. Kitzmiller decision be damned, apparently. It was defeated on the Senate floor, but by a too close margin. And there's certainly reason to be concerned about these attacks, especially given the Supreme Court's recent decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton, which weakened the constitutional separation of church and state, and in the process casually overturned much of the half-century of case law underlying the decisions that scuttled the second wave of anti-evolution activity. But those decisions were nevertheless well-reasoned and founded in fundamental constitutional principle. So I think that the prospects are nevertheless dim for a revival of the second wave of anti-evolution strategy. Second prediction, it's going to be a long time before the evolution wars ends, owing to the decentralization of American science education. With 13,500 odd local school districts having primary responsibility for curriculum and instruction, these are the district boundaries in the lower 48. Improvements in evolution education are inevitably going to be slow, scattered, and incremental. The fact that local school districts have primary control over curriculum and instruction is, by the way, why Betsy DeVos, Dick DeVos's wife, and the Secretary of Education in the first Trump administration didn't actually do any serious direct harm to science education, even though when she was asked point blank during her confirmation hearing whether a DeVos-led Department of Education would be siding with the students or with the purveyors of junk science, she evaded answering the question, using catchphrases, as we've seen, beloved by creationists and climate change deniers alike. But third and finally, among my predictions, the signs for the long term are promising. Look at this graph of American public opinion on evolution from 1985 to 2020. The gray shading indicates the 99% confidence interval. For the last 14 years, since 2012, we can be, that's 13 years, we can be confident that acceptance of evolution is more common among the American public than rejection. That's the blue line. Creationism may not be on the ropes yet, but it's headed that way. As you may know, I was going to be talking a month ago on Darwin Day in February, but we had to reschedule to March because of the inclement weather. In between, some new state-level data on acceptance of evolution came in. So I add this from the latest Pew Research Center Religious Landscape Survey. Michigan fares a little better than the US for the acceptance of evolution, 83% to 80%, although that difference is within the margin of error, so don't pat yourself on the back too hard. It's worth reflecting on the root causes of rejection of evolution for a little bit. It's a notoriously embarrassing fact that although American scientists overwhelmingly accept evolution, about 98% of scientists belonging to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, according to a 2014 survey, again from Pew, the US public is not quite so well squared away, only 65% of them in the same survey. So what's the reason for this disconnect? In a book review published in the New York Times in 1989, a well-known scientist offered a handful of possible diagnoses, saying, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But he didn't attempt to test these competing hypotheses, but tested they can be. In a 2012 US survey, for example, the common ancestry of humans and other animals was accepted by only 48% of respondents. But the claim that the theory of evolution says that humans share a common ancestry with other animals was accepted by 72% of respondents. To make sense of this, let's look at the crosstabs. Slightly more than half of the evolution rejectors lacked even a minimal understanding of evolution, insofar as they didn't agree that theory of evolution says that humans and animals, other animals, share common ancestors. And slightly less than half of the evolution rejectors rejected evolution while displaying at least this minimal understanding of what it involves. So about half of our evolution deniers are clearly ignorant. Is it plausible that the other half, about a quarter of the US population, are stupid or insane or wicked? That would be rather disturbing if so. But there's a neglected alternative. Someone can understand evolution yet reject it if they're in the grips of an ideology that prevents them from accepting it. What could such an ideology be? Well, something religious in nature, sure, but we can be more exact than that. Evolution in denial in the US is largely driven by inerrantism, the view that the Bible is without error in all that it teaches, including not only matters of faith and morals, but also matters of history and science. And hey, about a quarter of the US population reports taking an inerrantist view of the Bible. So if you want to improve public understanding and acceptance of evolution, it's not enough to address ignorance. You also have to address the ideologies that stand in the way, sometimes carrying signs. Of course, it's neither possible nor desirable to try to directly change the ideology of teachers and parents and members of the community who have religious reservations about accepting evolution, but it's possible to make evolution less threatening to such people. For example, by showing them that there are people who share their values yet accept the science. such as Francis Collins, the former director of the National Institutes of Health, and an evangelical Christian, or Kenneth R. Miller, not only the co-author of the most popular high school biology textbooks in use today, but also a Catholic. A different approach, and one perhaps more suited to a secular group like Michigan Humanists, is to make evolution less threatening by appealing to values that are neither religious nor anti-religious through, for example, Darwin Day events, which show that learning about evolution can be interesting and exciting and accompanied by scrumptious cake. There is going to be cake, right? I had promised that I would show the office, and there it is. One of NCSC's roles is to act as a crisis clinic for those facing challenges to evolution education in their schools, districts, and states. We've been doing that for a long time, and in, how long ago was it? About a dozen years ago, we added climate change to our portfolio because it was under similar attacks. Second, we conduct high quality and high impact research in science education, including several surveys on evolution education, several surveys on climate change education, and a recent study of climate change and state science standards. A third survey on evolution and climate change and the nature of science was sent out just last year. And third, NCSC has a program aimed at preparing teachers to effectively teach socially but not scientifically controversial topics like evolution and climate change more effectively, coordinating high quality programming for teachers across the country. And I think, Wendy, you were just at the Michigan Science Teachers Association doing that very thing. These are some of the dedicated Michigan teachers that we've been privileged to work with over the last few years. So at NCSC, we're working as hard and as smart as we can to defend and promote the teaching of evolution, as well as climate change. We value our alliances with the academic biologists and with the humanist community, and we welcome your support, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Glenn, for your stimulating talk. And this will be the time where we will take some questions. And just raise your hand, and I will pop over to you with a microphone. And if you could speak into the microphone, that would be great, so we can continue to get that on the video.
So I'm not sure when you wrote this speech, because a lot has changed in the last 2 months, but if the Department of Education is dismantled, what impact do you think that will have on things like the NGSS standards and how schools lead and the pressures to not teach evolution?
Yeah, I don't think that there will be any consequences, any direct consequences as regards science education. Again, by custom and statute, the federal government gets to say nothing about what's taught in public schools. It's a matter of local control. And while the present administration doesn't seem too interested in respecting custom or statute, nonetheless, the structures in place aren't in place. What are they going to do? Have Elon Musk emailed 100,000 high school principals who don't regard themselves as taking their orders from the federal government in the first place? So I don't think that's going to happen. I think schools in general are going to be badly hurt and in ways that they can't afford to be hurt, but it's not going to have a distinctive impact on science education.
Are you familiar with the Center for Inquiry's TIES program?
Yes, good old Bertha Vasquez. Yeah, we're very friendly with them. So if you don't know, the Center for Inquiry has a program run by Bertha Vasquez, a now retired middle school science teacher from Miami, who conducts teacher workshops aimed on evolution, specifically aimed at middle school teachers. And middle school teachers actually play a big role in evolution. They don't spend a lot of time teaching evolution full throttle because that's inappropriate for middle schoolers. But they do explain some basic concepts that middle schoolers need to be able to understand evolution when they do get it full throttle in high school. So that's a really good program.
So regarding the ignorant or insane hypothesis, has anyone looked at like the correlation between whether or not you accept evolution and like belief in something like, say, flat Earth?
I actually do study flat Earth in my spare time. It's really hard to do research on flat earthers because there are relatively few of them. And then it's also, I think, kind of hard to get grant-making agencies to take you seriously. If you say, I want money so I can survey 100,000 people so I can find 10 flat earthers and ask them what they think. Although I'm afraid that probably understates the prevalence of flat Earth. I figure flat Earth belief is in the low single digits in the US, which is absurd, of course.
All right, that seems to be all the questions today. Again, thanks a lot, Glenn, for coming today.